Welcome to our ATD Formal webinar in conjunction with the High Level Political Forum 2021. My name is Donald Lee. I'm president of the international movement ATD Formal, and it is my great pleasure to be your moderator today. We have a fantastic panel, and we have so many people attending from around the world. Let me just start by telling you a little bit about ATD Formal. It is a movement of solidarity with and between families and communities living in persistent poverty around the world. It's a movement in partnership with families that are the most excluded. And our core mission is to ensure that no one is left behind. And we reach out to those whose voices are still not heard and are often silenced. Our aim is to build long-term trusting relationships with communities, to invite new people to join the struggle against poverty, and to get involved with other community groups, organizations, networks, and institutions to work together with them to change policies and promote access for all for all um, for all the human rights. Through our involvement at the United Nations, we strive to offer a platform for these individuals and families to share not only their experiences of hardship and resilience, but also their courage and their determination to overcome the obstacles of persistent poverty, discrimination, and injustice. They are the first actors in this fight, and our role is to support and accompany them in this journey towards social justice. Today, our webinar will focus on addressing the tensions between extreme poverty and environmental conservation. This theme aligns with one of the four key priorities that our organization has chosen for the coming years, which is promoting a society respectful of all people and of the earth as a precondition for peace. The link between human rights, respect of the earth and environment, and peace is a crucial one, as our panelists will demonstrate today. The global pandemic we are going through today is a painful reminder that our societies treat their poorest members as they treat the planet, that is, badly. People living in poverty have been exploited for generations and are too often abandoned when their ability to work is exhausted. Around the world, struggling families and communities are often blamed and criminalized for their living practices and their impact on the environment. People living in poverty are often forced to rely on unsustainable practices precisely because they run out of options. And they face precarity and dispossession from their lands and have to resort to whichever practices they can hold on to for their survival. When policies are not designed with the participation of local communities, conservation efforts can be harmful and displace local communities. This can push them further into poverty and may even criminalize them for encroaching into conservation areas. Today, we will have the opportunity to learn more about this crucial issue thanks to the participation of powerful indigenous and local activists who will share some of the struggles their communities face as land and resources are being taken away from them. We will also hear from two professionals, one in the field of human rights and environmental justice, and the other on environmental management and sustainable development. Before I hand over to the first speaker, let me just remind you of two technical points. Our first speaker, Lejan, will be speaking in Portuguese. So we have interpretation into English. To activate the English interpretation, please look at your Zoom bar at the bottom of your screen and click on the globe icon to get the interpretation started. So we click on English to get the interpretation. While you're listening to the presentations throughout the webinar, you're most welcome to send in your questions either in the chat box or in the Q&A box during the webinar. And we will try to take as many questions as possible towards the end of the webinar. Without further ado, I'll now turn to our first speaker, Lejan Quilombola. Quilombolas are descendants of Afro-Brazilian slaves who escaped from plantations in Brazil until their abolition in 1888. Quilombo are settlements established by these communities And Lejan Quilombola is an educator and a leader of the Quilombola movement of Maranao, as well as a leader of Mokibong. And this is a collective of warrior women in resistance in Nazaré, Brazil. Now, if you please click on the interpretation globe and start your interpretation, I'll pass the floor over to Lejan. Lejan, please start.
Boa Me ouvem agora? Estão me ouvindo? Primeiramente, peço licença e proteção aos meus ancestrais e minhas ancestrais, para que possamos adquirir não apenas conhecimento, mas também sabedoria neste webinário. Eu sou Leidiane de Livramento Santos Regis, sou quilombola, moro no quilombo Nazaré. Meu quilombo fica localizado no território quilombola Mariano dos Campos, no município de Serrano do Maranhão, Brasil. Nasci no quilombo Soledade, neste mesmo território. Hoje sou conhecida como Leidiane Quilombola, bisneta por parte de mãe de uma indígena chamada Cristina Pires e Aniceto Santos, descendente de negros que foram trazidos de África para o Brasil. Por parte de pai, sou bisneta da indígena Marta Reis e do português Acelino Aleixo Reis. Sinto-me pertencida à ancestralidade afro-indígena, mas entristecida ao lembrar que minha bisavó Marta Reis foi violentamente retirada das suas raízes nas matas para casar, forçadamente com um branco desconhecido. Enquanto liderança do movimento quilombola do Maranhão Mokibong e do coletivo de mulheres guerreiras da resistência do Mokibong, vou expor os conflitos existentes em vários quilombos no estado do Maranhão. A luta do Mokibong não se resume a uma folha de papel dizendo que o território é nosso. Nós fazemos luta pelo território livre, ou seja, livre de qualquer forma de violência, qualquer forma de opressão, pois o território é sagrado. Os conflitos mais frequentes são extração ilegal de areia nos rios e nos pastos naturais, extração do barro para fazer telhas nas olarias por empresas de materiais de construção. Resulta no empobrecimento do quilombo e uso de trabalho escravizado. Desmatamento para o plantio de soja e eucalipto. O uso de agrotóxicos nessas plantações e extração ilegal da madeira. Isso resulta no envenenamento do solo, atingindo as roças dos quilombolas. Impacta na alimentação do quilombo, inclusive a alimentação dos animais. Vem causando doenças respiratórias e mudanças no clima. Impacta a espiritualidade, pois os pajés, benzedeiras, parteiras necessitam do território para cumprir a sua missão. O desmatamento expulsa os guardiões do território e afeta aquilo que é mais importante para nós, o rio. O rio, ele não morre, mas ele seca. É ele que faz a proteção do território, porque sem água não existe vida. Não terá como fazer produção de vida. Os quilombos vêm sofrendo com o avanço das cercas dos fazendeiros. Isso vem privando os quilombos terem acesso ao rio. As frutas nativas, as palmeiras de babaçu, as plantas medicinais, as praias para cobrir nossas moradias e etc. Existem quilombos que não conseguem fazer suas roças. E quando faz, fica cada vez mais difícil utilizar os saberes ancestrais. Sofremos com a negação do Estado em titular os territórios quilombolas e tentativa de mudança nas legislações ambientais e na lei de terras do Estado do Maranhão. Isso implica na facilitação de grilagem e roubo dos recursos naturais, assim como já houve a tentativa de fazer pesquisa de gás em território quilombola. A insistência do Estado e organizações na implantação de projetos agroflorestais, a economia verde, estão iludindo algumas pessoas para, sem explicar os impactos e doenças que podem começar a existir. Começam a invadir sem pedir licença ao território e sem uma consulta prévia e informada. Os primeiros impactos que já observamos em 2021 estão sendo o desmatamento, devastando inclusive áreas de plantas nativas, como jussareiras, conhecida como açaí em outros lugares. Nossa sustentabilidade vem basicamente da pesca e da roça, e aquilo que tiramos nas matas, sem violentá-la. Se tirar o território, nós não conseguimos sobreviver. Essas formas de violência afetam diretamente nossos direitos humanos. E quem mais sofre são os jovens e as mulheres, principalmente em relação à produção. Nós temos direito à vida. O território quilombola é nossa vida, porque não é só um espaço físico. Território quilombola e quilombo, mesmo com os conflitos, ainda é o lugar que nos sentimos livres para manifestar a nossa identidade. Nós estamos fazendo a defesa do território com os nossos corpos. E isso tem ligação com a fé espiritual e pertencimento às nossas raízes ancestrais. Estamos fazendo retomadas de territórios. O Moquibon surgiu cortando as cercas para libertar o território. Estamos fazendo a retomada da educação, uma educação a partir do território, para reconhecer os sistemas que nos oprimem, porque sabemos que a educação, assim como pode libertar o território, mas também pode oprimir. Uma educação antirracista, antipatriarcal e democrática. É necessário porque nós retornaremos à nossa ancestralidade e será essa geração e as futuras que precisamos prepará-las para dar continuidade a essas lutas. A metodologia da retomada da educação é desenvolver um ensino e aprendizagem contextualizado através de diálogo de saberes ancestrais e o conteúdo do livro didático. É possível falar do desmatamento no bioma da Amazônia a partir da realidade do nosso próprio território. Além das retomadas, o Moquibon faz um processo de trabalho de base, que é a missão quilombola, animando os quilombos para continuar fazendo a luta pelo território livre. Não basta apenas ser resistência. Tem que se rebelar para acabar com a opressão. A missão quilombola Ajudou na libertação do pagamento de foro. Pagavam para fazer as roças. Nós nos articulamos com outros estados do Brasil através da Articulação Nacional de Quilombos, ANQ, que assim como o Moquibon, não é aliado a governo. Aqui no estado do Maranhão, nós fazemos a defesa do território sagrado através da teia dos povos e comunidades tradicionais, que tece uma relação de cuidados em busca do bem viver. Fazemos encontros nos territórios a fim de fortalecê-los. Uma coisa importante na teia é a troca de sementes crioulas e o incentivo para fazer o reflorestamento, soberania alimentar, cuidado e proteção do território. Nessa luta pelo território livre, nós do Moquibon não fazemos parceria com organizações que só fazemos parcerias com organizações que fazem ou ajudam a fazer lutas em defesa da vida. E as que lutam para combater as desigualdades sociais. Nós não nos aliamos ao governo e nem fazemos parcerias com organizações que defendem ou são aliados ao Estado. Nós, quilombolas do Moquibon, somos fortalecidos pela espiritualidade, pelas forças da natureza, através do nosso instrumento de comunicação, que são os nossos tambores, cuícas, maracás, nossos cantos e movimentos dos nossos corpos. O nosso tambor de crioula e o tambor de mina não são manifestações culturais, são movimentos de proteção do território e cura dos nossos corpos através das plantas sagradas. Sei que a nossa luta em defesa do território não se resume ao Quilombo Nazaré e no Moquibon. Essa luta não tem fronteiras. Os limites geográficos são apenas imaginários. Agradeço pela oportunidade. Eu envio nesse momento a força do meu território quilombola e da espiritualidade para o mundo. Vou finalizar cantando um trecho de uma música em que o Moquibon reforça que nós construiremos o território livre na lei ou na marra. Já chega de tanto sofrer, já chega de tanto esperar. A luta vai ser tão difícil, na lei ou na marra nós vamos ganhar. A luta vai ser tão difícil, na lei ou na marra nós vamos ganhar. Se a gente morrer nessa luta, o sangue será uma semente. Territórios vamos conquistar, a história não falha e nós vamos ganhar. Territórios vamos conquistar, a história não falha e nós vamos ganhar. Território livre, já. Obrigada. Gratidão.
Oh, thank you so much, Lijan. That was inspiring, so very inspiring. I think you have given us so many insights into what is going on and how you have this struggle to retain and improve your role as custodians of the natural environment. And, you know, we will constantly support your efforts in this. Thank you so much. Let us move on now to a different continent. And we have with us Ms. Sila John Sanyeye, and she's a Maasai woman from the pastoralist communities of Arusha in Tanzania. Sheila was born and raised in the village of Navarrete, Simanjiro district. And after secondary school, she studied solar engineering in Colorado, US, and social development in Tanzania. Sheila has over 20 years experience working as a community organizer with women's groups in the Maasai district. Presently, Ms. Sanyeye is coordinator of the Light for Women's program with the NGO Pilot Light Development Organization, of Pilido for short. She works as an animator for grassroots groups of Maasai women who have self-organized for various development activities addressing their needs as pastoral women. May I invite Sheila to please give us her presentation, and may I remind you, we no longer have interpretation, so you can switch off the interpretation. Sheila, please go ahead.
Maasai and their families keep cattle in Kiteto, Simanjiro, Longido, and Ngorongoro district, which are the traditional land of Maasai in northern Tanzania. Maasai depends solely on their livestock, cattle, goats, and sheep. And keeping livestock means pastoralists need larger land, opening areas for land. Natural resources like spring water, salt link, and forest which trees to provide medicines from lives. Barks and roots for both human and animals. In the past, Maasai live and herds their livestock in Serengeti without any distraction of conflict between wildlife and people. There was a peace. In Maasai we called it Kiserian, and Amani in Swahili, between the pastoralist and natural world. In Maasai, Serengeti means a larger plain, flat plains, but now Maasai are forbidden to graze their cattle or even to live in Serengeti. Those days in Ngorongoro, the Maasai are still living and heading, but they create pressure because Ngorongoro Crater is a national conservation area. And the tourism brings in millions of dollars per year. The presence of the Maasai is now in conflict with national interest and conflict between wildlife and people. Those lands suffered from long-term droughts due to climate change and were grabbed our national parks, wildlife management areas, hunting blocks, leisure and small-scale farming. Because of this, many of the pastoralists moved south to the region of Morogoro, Tanga, in each pasture and water. Mobility is also important for pastoralists to be able to overcome diseases. In traditional hunting lands, pastoralists had arid and humid areas for grazing land. They have a natural calendar in their mind to know when to move from one place to another. That calendar is now a burden dream because larger open space areas of pastoralist land are now cultivated, turned into wildlife management and conservation areas. Larger farms, mining areas, towns and cities. Together, those factors are changing the relationship between pastoralists and their natural environment. In the past, Maasai were confident of how to survive a drought environment. They inherit knowledge from past generation, really on their freedom of movement, and they take care for their land and natural resources. Maasai are natural conservationists. Those days, with climate change, loss of open spaces of land, forest, and natural water sources, with education and change in roles of men and women, traditionally, knowledge is not enough to survive. Changes are coming very fast, and without this traditional of livestock, land and natural resources, pastoralist societies are becoming impoverished, with women mostly vulnerable. Without head of poor to own head and land, some Maasai women are running to cut down trees, making a digging charcoal themselves. Then the women sell the charcoal for a little as $50 to per bag. This is not a natural part of Maasai women lives and leads to overwork, poor health, and harassment of forest preservative officers. As a result of this rapid change, more and more people from pastoralist communities are becoming forced to abandon their cultural practices. And in some cases, men and Moran, young men, are looking for work. And this movement to the cities is caused by massive wave of poverty in families and increase of HIV. Young men and elders leave the families and take up to the responsibility of children and homestead. But women have no ownership, productive means like livestock or land. Presently, in the Maasai district, more than 80% of this population lives below the poverty line, where traditional Maasai pastoralists were prosperous and self-reliance. Solutions. In an effort to create policies to address the effects of poverty and climate change and support women, Pilot Light Development Organization, PLIDO, has established a women's development department called the Light for Women program, which I coordinating. Presently, Light for Women is implementing programs that support small-scale entrepreneurship, projects like grinding mills for women groups, a small business for individual women, buying and selling corns, tea leaves, selling fruits and vegetables. Microfinance loans, share a goods project, securing title deeds for women plots. Light for Women teach women various things such as especially land tenure rights, gender rights, rights for their children, climate change, environmental rights, and rights to health and safety. Some techniques developed to run pastoralist activities can be used to address the challenges of climate change. However, long solution will require investment in development projects that are conducive to sustainable development. Solution will also be required that focus changes in national policy, including promoting regional cooperation to provide the rights of pastoralists. The core staff of pilot are professional social development practitioners and experience working with pastoralist community in some social organizations. Holistic health, livestock management, land tenure, natural resources management, and staff are pastoralists from Maasai district. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you, Sheila, for that very insightful presentation. I know people are maybe a little bit puzzled. Sheila is with us in person, but because of a poor connection, she decided today to present a pre-recorded message. So rest assured that if you have any questions you want directed to Sheila, please put them on because she will be here to respond to them in person. Our next speaker is Yves Ledor. He's representative of Earth Justice to the UN in Geneva. Yves works as an independent consultant, and since 1991, he has been mandated by Earth Justice to represent the UN in Geneva, focusing on the links between human rights and the environment. And this includes the role of civil society, the human impact on climate change, pollution, and toxic products, the right to water, and to a healthy and sustainable environment. So I'm sure we'll have a very interesting insight from a professional working with an NGO on the issue that we're discussing today. Yves, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Donald, and thank you all for having me. It's quite a timely discussion, and I want also to thank the really excellent presentation we just heard, which really point out to the reality of the situation we are in. Let me share the screen with you, and I hope I'm able to manage this correctly. One of the points I wanted to underline in this discussion is one of the discussion that is going on right now at the international level, which is very often called as a 30-30-30. There's different ways to pronounce it. But basically the idea is to protect 30% of land and water in 2030. We have to be careful because you have other type of 30-30, also, for example, on women's rights, like having 30% of women in parliaments and so on. So we have to be careful with that. But right now, on the issue which have been presented right now, the international debate is focusing on this issue of having so many, so much land protected, which would be 30% of land and water being protected. Now, why that? This is linked to the fact that the Convention on Biodiversity, which should have met in 2020, was unable because of the COVID. So they're supposed to meet later this year, but it's still not exactly, we still don't know exactly when. So the question still needs to be fixed. But in 2020, they should have decided of a new agenda, because the previous agenda, which were called the Aichi targets, which actually were not really met, had defined the work in the field of the conservation of biodiversity. What are the targets to be reached? What are the policy to develop, so that all of the efforts of the parties to this convention go in the same direction. So now there is a need to renew this, and so the discussion is what will be the next plan? And the question of this 30-30 could be one of the key elements. It's not the entire plan, but it could be one or a flagship for the new plan. One of the objective also is to try to have something that is a bit similar to the 1.5 degrees, so this kind of limit that we're supposed to keep below in order to avoid too strong global warming. So there's something which is pretty easy to talk about in the public domain about climate change, although it's a very complicated issue, but at least we have a reference. And so some hope that this will become a reference also in the field of biodiversity. And it should be noted also that it's interesting that the new United States presidency, the President Joe Biden, has taken up the task that the US be leaders in that in their own country. So it's not just for the others, it's also for them. And President Biden has signed a presidential order so that 30% of federal land and water be protected in 2030. And this has triggered an incredible debate in the sense that now we see oil companies and agribusiness claiming that this is land grabbing, which is a bit unbelievable for us who are struggling against land grabbing by these companies throughout the world. So there's a sudden change of situation because of the 30-30 in the United States. But then after what we just heard, let's have a look at what does this mean, having this 30-30 as an objective. Of course, I would say one of the very first problems we have with the Convention of Biodiversity is precisely this word of biodiversity, because when we're talking about biodiversity, we are talking about an element of the ecosystem. It's the biodiversity related to ecosystems, but this hides a bit the word ecosystems as such, which is really the heart of the matter. So what do we need for ecosystems? And here we see how they are linked to a number of different elements and of different scope. And precisely one of the elements, and that was very, very well said by Sila, is you need space. Ecosystems always live in a space. So some are smaller, but then they're related to bigger ones. But you always need a certain amount of space for the ecosystems to be able to be self-sustaining and to be able to be developed. So this is one of the problems we have. One of the main ones is that there is less and less, and that was very well described a few minutes ago, there's less and less space for the natural systems to be able to just survive and develop normally. So it is becoming a real problem, and that's why more and more we're saying we need to have more space for the ecosystems to be able to function. They need time also. Ecosystems have always evolved, and that's a current argument, an argument we're hearing all the time. Yes, that's true. They have always evolved, and it's true that species even have disappeared. It's true also that you had extinctions, but that's over time. Even extinctions go through several thousands of years. It's not something that happens from one day to the other. What we are witnessing right now is a disappearance of ecosystems, of species, and so on in 2 centuries. 2 centuries. This is an incredible speed. That's never happened before in the natural world. So you need space and you need time. And of course, you need also to respect the fact that ecosystems are self-organized systems, which is probably one of the most difficult things to admit in the way we are managing all these spaces. And that's why they need space and time. And they need this in order for the integrity of the system so that it can work and functions correctly, and also that it can connect to the other ecosystems. Here on this picture, we have a beautiful bird. Probably that would be a bird that would be rather a local ones. You have much smaller birds, which go through different ecosystems from the north to the south of the planet. So the ecosystems are related to each other. So they need both the integrity and the connectivity. So it's true that by putting this on the table, this idea of 30-30 is really raising the relevant questions, and questions that until today, and actually in many, many circumstances still today, are very difficult to raise, because we say, well, what we want is productivity, growth, and then still growth. But we never talk about these other elements, about time and space for natural species and natural systems to be able to survive. But then we have to be very careful, because what must be very clear is that protected area does not always cover the entirety of an ecosystem. Very often protected areas are just focusing on one specific area within an ecosystem. And then for those who are familiar with protected area management, you always have the problem of what is called the bumper zones. Because precisely, usually your protected area is part of a larger ecosystem, and if the ecosystem itself is collapsing, your protected area will collapse too. So then you have a problem because the territory which is protected does not fit with the needs of the ecosystem itself. So the question when we're protecting an area is always to know, where are we doing it? Because in a number of countries, we see that, for example, the protected areas don't even cover at least the biodiversity hotspots. They're done somewhere else. So, okay, then what is the purpose? And that's precisely the second question. Why are we protecting it? And I think there was a very good example that was just mentioned a few minutes ago by Sila, which is, for example, we do it for tourism. Because it's beautiful area. Yes, beautiful area does not mean yet you're managing the whole of the ecosystem. You're managing a beautiful area so people can look at it, and that's for tourism, income, and so on. But that does not fit always with the protection of the ecosystem themselves. So the two questions is where and why are absolutely crucial. And of course, the third question is, what about the rights holders around these protected areas? And purposely here, I'm taking a picture from the Stockholm Resilience Institute showing fishermen and people from on freshwater rivers, and very often forgotten. And they are managing also ecosystems. They are directly related, and a lot of them have lost their revenues, have lost their incomes, have lost their livelihoods because of mismanagement, because of industrial developments, because of competition with other industrial fishing, and sometimes also because of protected areas. So again, there are always right holders in any area of the world, and we have to see how do they relate. And the very first thing is the question of self-determination. Do you have people who have always lived there, who basically are the custodians, the guardians, or we could even say the owners of that land? And very often this has been disregarded when it's a very, very crucial element. And these people have rights, and they don't only have rights because they manage well their ecosystem, they have rights because they are our equals. This is the very first thing. We're hearing again and again, for example, when we talk about indigenous people, we should protect them because they protect the land. No, we should protect them because they are our equal, and actually we should not protect them. We should just give them the same rights as we have. This is absolutely a crucial human rights issue. On the top of that, historically speaking, it is true that they are also the custodians of large ecosystem, and Sila just said it very well, and then they have probably a lot to share with us. And so that's why we need an equal dialogue, and that's what is very often missing in this situation. Then of course we have to see the livelihoods, what are the relations of the livelihoods of the people in this area, and what is the sustainability? How are we managing this together? So this is a very important question, and we can really hope that in the discussion at the Convention on the Biodiversity, once it will really stay, it's supposed to take place in Kunming in China. Probably because of COVID, it will be done finally only online. But we hope that there will be some of these elements in the discussion on the Convention on Biodiversity, and that the relevant questions raised by 3030 will be linked to these other elements. Otherwise, we will be again losing ground. But I don't want to finish on a sad note. I'm going to show here what is happening in New Zealand, in Wanganui, and I suppose the next speaker can probably correct me because he has probably much more to say about this situation. But this is a very, very interesting and pioneering project. In New Zealand, the Maori in this area, around this river, have been fighting for this area for years. It's a very long story. But the end is an interesting one because a few years ago, this river, which I've not been able to pronounce its name correctly, but this river has been granted rights, which is a very first step. And what is very interesting is not only that on the paper they are being given some rights, because you also have this which happened in India or happened in Colombia. So it's not the only place where such a thing has happened, but here they have developed a mechanism in order to manage this, where you have a representative of the Maori community and a representative of the state. So both the state and the local community are both together custodians. What is very interesting is that they have to merge two cultures, two different ways to see this. And it's a very interesting dialogue between science and very old traditional custodian culture around this. So I think here we have a pioneering example of what can be done in order to protect an area. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Yi. That was the introduction to everybody about the efforts that are being made at various levels in the intergovernmental process, multilateral process, to try to address some of these very critical issues about what is happening to biodiversity and the ecosystem. And here we see straight away the conflicts that have emerged that our first two speakers talked about. The collision between traditional resource management and what is happening with modern development concepts. So we really have to rethink about what is of value and how development should proceed. Certainly, the rights of indigenous people to self-management and preservation and conservation of the lands is very important. Our fourth speaker has experience in UNEP. He's David Smith. He's based in UNEP's Africa office, and he's the chief economist and regional coordinator for the Africa component of the UNDP UNEP Poverty Environment Action for the SDGs. The acronym is PEA. The PEA and its precursor, the UNDP UNEP Poverty Environment Initiative, support governments to integrate sustainable environmental and natural resources management into national and sector development planning and budgeting process. So this is he's looking at the nitty-gritty of policy management and policy formulation. It'd be very interesting to hear what he has to say about what's going on at the present moment. David, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Kia ora, everyone. I was intrigued to see an example from New Zealand, actually. That was very interesting. But I'm going to talk about what we do in Africa. And it is unfortunately very true that there can be a conflict between preservation, conservation, and poor people. And based on our experiences and what we've learned, I'd like to give a few suggestions as to how we can reduce the potential for conflict. And the first point is that we focus on sustainable management rather than preservation or conservation. Words matter, and words like preservation and conservation, protection, suggest to us at least locking up. And that's not what we in the UN believe we should be doing. So when we advise governments, we emphasize sustainable management. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, that's what the focus is. And the umbrella objective of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals is to eradicate poverty in whatever form or wherever it occurs, the principle of leaving no one behind. So how do we minimize the conflict between wanting to manage the environment, natural resources sustainably, and the overarching objective of reducing poverty? Well, one of a very important tool that we use to convince governments to invest in sustainability, but to do so in a way that helps eliminate poverty, is we carry out economic analysis that demonstrates just how dependent people are on the environment and natural resources. For example, in Malawi, we found that rural households, 18% on average of their household income comes from forests. So if we and the government decided to, build a fence around the forest, you immediately deprive people, households, of 18% of their income. And that would be devastating to people who live on, who are on very poor already. So we get disaggregated evidence of how dependent people are on the environment and natural resources. And we need to get that evidence in a disaggregated manner, particularly between men and women. And we found it's very important that women be interviewed, surveyed separately from men. Because if we do it together, for cultural reasons, the views of the men dominate. And sometimes the views of the men are inconsistent with what's in the best interest of the woman and the children. For example, in certain districts in Tanzania, we found out that overgrazing, by there being too many cattle for this area of land, was a problem. There were many cattle, and also food insecurity, especially in female-headed households, was a serious problem. And one of the reasons why food insecurity was so bad is that the women wanted to grow crops to feed children, maize, for example, beans, but the men wanted cattle, including for prestige. And it was through interviewing and having the cattle meant there was less land for crops. And it was through interviewing separately the men and the women that these details started to come out. So once you've got a very accurate figure, a very comprehensive picture of the value of the environment, natural resources to people in quantitative and qualitative terms, then you need to look at who has control, you know, who makes the decisions about how natural resources are used. And then you need to work with the stakeholders, the communities, the decision makers in governments, the donors who give money for projects, and design the policies designed to reduce deforestation, and do it in a manner that gives incentives for poor people, because they know they will not be locked out of the forest. And if their access is reduced, there's an alternative. Like in Rwanda, some parts of Rwanda, the government is supplying cooking gas so that people have an incentive not to go and cut trees for charcoal to cook food. So you need to provide an alternative, and you need to provide an alternative that's designed, I emphasize this, in a gendered disaggregated manner. Women are more concerned about spend a lot of time collecting water, cooking. So what is an alternative that will address the needs of the woman? That is an example. And where natural resources, say a national park is set up, or there needs to be some reduction in deforestation, the income from the national forest, the income from the national park, the income from, like, say, logging some of the timber for commercial sale, there has to be equitable benefit sharing. And that's another reason why it's important to do a comprehensive economic analysis, so you understand how people rely, and do an analysis on the options. And I don't mean a kind of a financial analysis. I mean a comprehensive economic analysis that looks at non-market, non-monetary values, not just, you know, a traditional neoliberal type economic analysis. We don't want that. We carry out comprehensive, disaggregated analysis that looks at the poverty and its causes in detail. So if people are treated with respect and their needs are met, then efforts to have sustainable land use, sustainable forestry, sustainable water use, they're far more likely to succeed and be sustainable. So this is why we recommend that a key emphasis on equitable benefit sharing in order to incentivize poor people to help sustain and manage our environment, which in the long term will be in their interests. And what we do with these policy recommendations, because the UN can only recommend, unless we're the Security Council, we can't actually force governments to do anything. But this economic analysis is very powerful for convincing the very important decision makers in countries. And these are the ministries of planning, of finance, of agriculture. So you need to target the people who make the decisions that impact the most on the environment. It's not environmentalists who damage, or decisions by environmentalists that damage the environment. It's decisions by ministries of planning, finance, agriculture, for example, that impact the most. So you need to convince the decision makers in those ministries that it is in the national interest and the interests of poor people to invest in sustainability in a way that will benefit poor people. And that can be quite a complicated and long-term process. But ultimately, if we are to be successful in sustainable development that contributes significantly towards poverty reduction, we have to convince these decision makers who are outside the normal, if you like, environmental list of stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, David. I think it gives us a different take on issues, how institutionally governments and other decision makers, and of course, I think the private sector are working with indigenous groups around the world under the umbrella of sustainable development to try to address these issues that we have been talking about. But of course, going from point A to point B is easier said than done, because one of the things that is missing clearly, and you've mentioned this in your presentation, is the lack of representation, adequate representation by indigenous groups and people who are living in extreme poverty. Where their voices are often not heard. We don't have a lot of time left. We have like 13 minutes left before we end this webinar. I'd like to pose Beijing and Sila first a question about the specific role played by women in community-led land protection. Maybe Lijian and Sila can tell us just how they are planning to expand the role of women in community land protection. Just what are the steps that they're looking for? And for David and Yves, what kind of support can international organizations such as UNDP and NGOs like Earth Justice do to help local groups of women engage in nature preservation? So I just want to have these two sides of the argument looked at. Maybe we can start with Lijian, then followed by Sila. I give the floor to Lijian first. Please keep it brief, as we have very little time.
Mais uma vez, boa tarde. De que forma a gente pode estar expandindo essa luta das mulheres em defesa do território. E como é que a gente faz essa defesa? Eu sempre digo o seguinte, que as mulheres, ela é guardiã do território, e as mulheres, a gente faz produção de vida. A gente faz produção de vida e, ao mesmo tempo, defende o território. Porque a gente, no momento que a gente sai e entra no território, a gente busca aquilo que traz a nossa sustentabilidade sem violentar o território. Nós olhamos uma árvore, a gente não quer derrubá-la para fazer uma cadeira, uma mesa. Nós olhamos uma árvore, a gente quer tirar aquilo que é bom para a nossa saúde. A gente tira da árvore principalmente as plantas medicinais, aquilo que a gente vai fazer, os nossos remédios. A mulher, ela tira de uma árvore a semente para fazer os nossos colares de proteção. Ela vai no rio, ela tira do rio a sustentabilidade. Ela tira o peixe, na maioria das vezes, só para a gente se alimentar. Da terra, ela usa a terra para produzir o nosso próprio alimento, a mulher, para a gente continuar vivo, sem usar veneno. Então, a mulher, ela não vê o território apenas como mercadoria. E é por isso que eu digo que a mulher, ela produz vida. O agronegócio, ele produz mercadoria, produz aquilo que mata, o veneno. E a mulher não, ela produz vida, porque tudo aquilo que a gente faz é para a gente continuar vivo. De que forma a gente pode continuar expandindo essa luta e reconhecer que as mulheres estão fazendo a defesa do território? Hoje, aqui no estado do Maranhão, a gente tem esse grupo de mulheres guerreiras da resistência, e que nós vamos até as comunidades, até os quilombos, fazer pequenas rodas de conversa, construindo um diálogo justo e descolonizado entre homens e mulheres, para justamente reconhecer a importância dela em defesa do território. Hoje a gente também consegue, através da conectividade, através da internet, ter diálogo com mulheres até de outros países, para justamente nos fortalecer sobre isso. Espero ter respondido um pouco da pergunta.
Oh, thank you, Lishan. Sheila, do you want to tell us a little bit more about how women are being empowered in their activities? Go ahead, Sheila.
Sheila, we cannot hear you. Is your mic close to you? Okay, try to say something now. Oh no, it looks like your mic is not working. No, sorry, Sheila. Let us try to fix it. Maybe Donald can get back to you, and I will try to fix it on the side with you.
We seem to be having some technical problems with Sheila. Let me just give the floor to Eves and then David, and then we'll come back to see when she has a connection. Eves, you want to go ahead and just say something?
Yes, well, thank you very much. I think the main thing where we can be helpful is to help the representation of people who are working in the field when they think that it can change for them to do something at the international level. And in a number of circumstances, it does change a thing. some things just to start with is to be recognized as someone with who you're going to have to talk to by the government. And sometimes we see too often in Geneva situations where it's the first time that some people were able to talk with their own authorities, because in Geneva, they also have the pressure for the governments, and they need then to show that they are open for a dialogue and so on. And then the dialogue happens. So these situations, for example, are situations where we can help. Now, of course, you don't always have to go through a regional or international system. The other element, for example, which is extremely important, is all what we're trying to mobilize for the protection of environmental defenders, people who are active today, confronting development projects, industrial developments, and so on very often. And this comes even from all of the human rights organizations. They see that they are the most targeted today. And that's where we're having and witnessing, unfortunately, the worst increase of violence. So this is a real, very worrying thing. And we do all what we can to try to put this on the table so that it is denounced and of course stopped. Because if people cannot act for the environment freely, then of course we're really heading in the very wrong direction. I mean, this is absolutely a crucial issue. So I would say these are the two things immediately as a very first answer, I would say we're trying to do at the international level on our side.
Thanks, Yves, for that response. David, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, thanks for the question. One of the things that we have found is useful is targeting capacity building at the poorer people, the most vulnerable, and disaggregating that capacity building. For example, capacity building for women on climate smart agriculture, for example, and also helping groups to prepare submissions for district development plans and to participate in forums. And sometimes a simple thing like the UN paying allowances to, say, a women's group to attend district development planning sessions. So because they don't have the money to get a matatu or whatever to the meeting. So simple things like that. And persistent, if you like, lobbying of governments to make sure that the more vulnerable have a voice, and you know, once the government says, oh, all right, then we as UN need to step in and help provide the capacity building and the finances so people can participate in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I have been informed by the organizers that we can perhaps extend the time of the webinar until about 2:30. But of course, if you have to go earlier at 2:15, the original time when we would end this webinar, you are free to leave. So we'll just continue if that's okay with you.
So, Donald, I can actually put Sila on speaker. I'm with her on WhatsApp, and she would like to say a few words. Can you?
Okay, so we'll get back to Sila right now because of connection.
Sila, can you try to speak? Donald, can you hear her? Okay, go ahead, Sila.
I still see a speaker meeting.
Small microfinancing according to their needs. Choose
Sorry, Sila, people cannot hear.
their children.
People cannot hear. Sorry, I'm getting the message that it's not loud enough from the phone. Can you try to unmute yourself one last time? Ah, can you try to unmute yourself one last time? And I can hear you, but apparently the audience cannot hear you. You can say maybe one last sentence.
I say that women in Maasai, they don't have right to anything.
The mic is-
And
Go ahead.
through supporting them with small grant activities, training them to know their rights, to make children, especially girls, to go to school, and also train them on climate change, to make them to not disturb the environment, like cutting down trees, to make charcoal or firewood, and selling charcoal. And women, they are cutting charcoal, as I said before, for getting money for to support their family. And this is not a traditional way of life or Maasai. This is because our land is grabbed with mining people, conservation, and larger scale farming, and make the land of Maasai to be small. And men, they are running to the cities to find other possibilities of living without anything at home. And the women, they are not able to sell cattle, and is not allowed. So they use another means to find the means of supporting their children.
Thank you, Sila. Thank you so much. I hope that the audience was able to hear you. And if you want to share anything else, feel free to write it in the chat box. Thank you so much, Sila.
Thank you very much, Monica.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you. I know you have some terrible difficulties with technology. Maybe David, you could take note something during the within UNDP. You know, can UNDP perhaps do something to provide technical support to indigenous groups and people in poverty around the world, to give them voice and to provide them access to adequate internet access, for instance? You know, this is something which the UNDP country officers can do. Something for you to think about. I don't expect an answer immediately, but maybe that's something that can be part of UNDP policy, to reach out to groups to provide them with the internet access.
Yeah.
There are lots of questions, and even with the 2:30 deadline, we have about 12 minutes left. Let me just pose a question. I think it's quite an important question to Li Jian. And this is, she talked about how, you know, her community and the women warriors are protecting their traditional practices and the environment, and they're doing conservation work. The question somebody posed is, what could be done to balance the traditional practices and opportunities for economic activity in your region that provide jobs and economic benefits for the rest of the population? All right, that's the first thing. How do you balance the economic? And would your community be interested in benefiting from agriculture in your territories, or would you prefer to that the territory be left absolutely free of economic activities and left pristine and untouched? Lijan, I think that's a very important question that we would like to hear from. Lijan, you have the floor.
A gente vê o seguinte, a gente faz a defesa do território porque a gente não vê ele apenas como um espaço físico. Quando a gente fala que quando os sistemas de opressão invadem o território e empobrecem o quilombo, a gente não está falando de empobrecimento em termos de dinheiro do capital. Porque quando, por exemplo, tem um desmatamento, quando você derruba uma árvore frutífera, você está tirando dali o sustento do quilombo. Então, as mulheres guerreiras da resistência, ela vem trazer uma mensagem de que é possível a gente tirar nossa sustentabilidade, não pensando só no capital, no dinheiro. E nesse sentido, a gente vê que os sistemas de opressão, ele obriga as comunidades tradicionais a deixar as suas raízes ancestrais. Obriga a gente não usar mais dos conhecimentos dos nossos povos ancestrais. E a gente vem com as mulheres fazer um novo diálogo de resgatar isso, da importância disso para a gente hoje. O conhecimento dos nossos ancestrais, ele faz a defesa do território. E é possível a gente, através de, digamos, do próprio conhecimento científico, de também fazer essa defesa. Eu sempre digo assim, que quando trouxeram os meus ancestrais da África para cá, haviam as fazendas de cana-de-açúcar. Por exemplo, aqui no meu quilombo, no Quilombo Nazaré, tinha uma fazenda. Mas, na época, não tinha essa questão do veneno. Mas, hoje, através dos nossos conhecimentos tradicionais, a gente pode tirar nossa sustentabilidade do território sem colocar esse veneno, mas, através dos conhecimentos científicos, a gente pode ver como a gente pode, eu digo que talvez, não sei se é esse o nome, restaurar a terra, mesmo que isso leve por séculos a gente tirar esse veneno da terra, mas é possível através do conhecimento científico. Usar da parte boa da ciência para a gente também fazer a defesa, juntando esses conhecimentos ancestrais com o conhecimento científico. As mulheres, a gente acha importantíssimo dar continuidade, porque nós vemos que o futuro, para a gente ter realmente o nosso objetivo, que é o território livre de qualquer forma de opressão, a gente vê esse futuro na ancestralidade. É através da ancestralidade que fará com que o povo se sinta pertencido ao território. Por que a gente fala muito disso? É porque, através da ancestralidade, o povo se sentindo pertencido, é possível unir a luta para a gente continuar tendo o direito de existir.
Thank you, Lijan. Let me just throw this question to Sila very quickly. Do you agree? Would you want to preserve the pastoralist communities as they are? Would you want to keep the Maasai communities as they are, or are you do you see the future in expanding development? You said that they do they produce charcoal and so on, which can be quite detrimental to the environment. But you know, of course, the survival of the community depends on having sustainable economic activity. So, do you agree with what Lijan has said? But in regard to the Maasai community, very quickly.
Yeah, Donald, can you repeat your question for Sila?
It's basically the same question that was asked of Lijan. In the future, what is your goal? Do you want to have the Maasai community remain in the same way they are functioning traditionally? Or are you prepared to introduce change, which is being forced upon you, like tourism and agriculture? I just want to see what your views are.
Because the Maasai land is very huge land and it's open, so people they are coming there to grazing land or for the hunting. And Maasai they are moving from other places which they are not suitable for livestock. That is why Maasai they are getting in trouble with the conflict between those people who are coming to their land.
Okay, thank you, Sila.
Thank you, Sila.
I have a couple of one question which I want to pose to David and Eve. One is clearly one of the things that's missing is easy access to justice, equal justice to all these indigenous groups and people around the world living in poverty, who are living on the margins of society and the environment. Right, poor people basically live in the worst. Worst environmentally affected areas. So how do we guarantee that these groups have access to justice, to the justice system? Yves, do you want to tackle that?
Well, guarantee is a very strong word. I mean, you're right. That's what should happen. That's why it should be guaranteed. That's exactly what all the human rights systems are trying to achieve. And that's why we have a number of instruments. I mean, for example, the indigenous people have fought for a number of years and finally achieved to have a declaration on the rights of indigenous people. You also have today a declaration on the rights of peasants and other people working in rural areas. These instruments, even though they're not as strong, legally speaking, as we would like them to be, they are there, and at least they underline the legitimacy of the claims, of the actions of the people who are protected by these declarations. This is, for example, an important element. Now, on the top of that, and I think someone in the chat mentioned Indigenous Peoples Forum, you have a number of indigenous instances working in the UN where indigenous people themselves are working. You have, for example, an indigenous forum within the Convention on Climate Change, where you have an equal representation of indigenous people and of countries. So I think if we see the struggles that indigenous people have gone through over the last decades, they have done remarkable achievements within the international system and international institutions. And that gives them a stronger voice, that gives them more legitimacy, and it's quite impressive. Now, of course, the problem is a power imbalance. Even with these successes, indigenous peoples are still far, and much too far from having the same power as transnational corporations, big corporations, and all of these kind of things. So this is still part of the struggle that we have in the field, in our own countries and at the international level. I'm speaking for a country who is sitting on the good side of the fence, if I can call it like that, because you have groups of countries, let's say if we take the whole of the European countries, whether in or out of EU, this is a detail, we're all pretty well off because of history. We don't have any personal merit for that. It's just happened, it's a legacy we inherit and we benefit from. And this this power imbalance has not been changed. I mean, we're still living on the matrix of colonization, and we've changed a lot of things, but the bases are still the same. And I think what we've heard from our two friends from the field is a very clear indication of that. So we're struggling with the institutions. We're trying to make things being a bit better. We have improved. You still have a negotiation going on, for example, on to have a binding treaty on transnational corporations and other business enterprises. So we're trying to use these systems as much as possible. And then you have the regional systems. And then you have also at the national level, I know, for example, in Kenya, the National Human Rights Institution is very active on a number of issues. And people in Kenya can go and directly knock at the door and at least be listened to. So you do have mechanisms like that exist. But again, you know, it's an uphill battle, and the steep is pretty big.
Oh, thank you, Yves. David, I know I'm putting you on the spot because you really can't speak on behalf of the UN or UNDP in terms of, but just give us some idea. What sort of things can we do to provide better access to justice?
In practical terms, examples of what we do is like assuming the government has laws on paper at least to give justice to all, and most countries do. Then when we have projects, we write into the project document, the stakeholder consultation, the rights of groups to be consulted while we're implementing the project or supporting the government. So we can do things like that. We can do some capacity building, like what you said about internet, giving groups airtime so they can participate, look at little things like that. But it's very much a work in progress, and a lot needs to be done, in some countries more than others, but we try. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We've gone past 2:30. So I really would like to thank our panelists for taking the time and sharing with us their expertise and their experiences. Especially, I think most of us would agree, it's so good to hear from the indigenous groups, the Maasai, and from Brazil, the traditional conservationists who have made it very clear to us just what the challenges are and what the costs are for not responding. So, a big thank you. Let's join a big thank you for all our panelists today. And before I leave, let me thank Monica and her team for preparing the logistics of this meeting, and also for Eduardo Simas, who provided the translation into Portuguese. And before we all go away, I just want to make the point that what we've heard today just underscore the fact that we need more space for the ecosystem to survive. We need more rights being recognized and being implemented and honored in order to protect the environment that we have. There must be a dialogue between the ancestors that indigenous people have acquired and the people who have the powers to make policies. There must be participation to have their voices heard. Development policies that we have today, I think a lot of people now question whether it is the right way to ensure that the environment is respected and protected. So let us leave this webinar with this thought in mind. We need more space for the ecosystem to live. We need more space for the ecosystem to survive. And the only way we can do that is to ensure that the development we talk about is development that promotes the conservation of our natural environment. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you all the participants who come from around the world. We had more than 100 people attending at one time. So
thank you so much, everyone.
goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.